Welcome to Small Insight, Big Impact. I am your host, Dr. David Cheche. Today I'm going to share with you my reflection on the report that was released by the United Nations regarding the declaration of water bankruptcy and what leaders must know. Yes, the rule of global water situation has changed forever, moving from crisis to bankruptcy. If you've been following the sector for a while, in 2025, the UN had a meeting that identified four priorities for global leaders in preparation for the 2026 Water Conference in UAE. And those four priorities were to create or are to create a framework for value in water, unlock scalable mechanisms, scale what is already working, and promote policies that supports innovation. So, on the 20th of January 2026, scientists at the United Nations University used a phrase that should stop every leader to think twice. The world has entered an era of global bankruptcy. They actually moved from water being stress or water scarcity into bankruptcy, and that is a significant change because the use of bankruptcy signals precise uh, situation of the cry of what is happening. Today I'm going to explain what leaders must understand about this new reality, particularly what a bankruptcy actually means, what is different from a water crisis, what the report says and what the report doesn't say, and what governance now requires or actions that we expect governance to undertake. Because in this era, leadership or governance leadership will be measured by discipline actions. So let's begin. What exactly is water bankruptcy? What does it really mean for us? Well, I think the word was taken from the finance sector. And in finance, bankruptcy is the shortage of cash and also a structural condition. And that is when your liability exceeds your assets. And in that situation, you are actually operating beyond your means. You are spending capital to survive in the present. Literally, that's what it means. So, the United Nations scientists are saying that humanity has reached that point with water, where we are no longer relying only on renewable flows such as rainfall, rivers, seasonal replenishment, but rather we are drawing down the planet's water capital, the aquifers that are recharged over centuries, the wetlands that regulate our floods and also our shorelines, the glaciers that feed our rivers, the lakes that sustain our ecosystems and economies. So, in other words, bankruptcy or water bankruptcy means that these reserves are being depleted faster than they can be replenished. So, water bankruptcy is not simply a drought problem or simply a climate variability problem, it is a systemic overshoot. This is because while water crisis assumes a recovery posture or approach, water bankruptcy forces reckoning. And that's one thing we need to remember. The report actually, it's very clear about the diagnosis of the situation. And that I must give kudos to the scientists that worked on the report. It clearly talks about how the scale of the problem around the world, the groundwater levels that are declining in our major aquifers, large lakes that are shrinking, wetlands that are disappearing, and then the threat to our glaciers. So these are well articulated in the report. And also billions of people that are experiencing severe water scarcity during different times of the year. And not to talk about the impact it has on our agricultural activities and also on our economic activity. So all these have been well articulated. And then finally, the way cities are actually being built or expanding into hydrological limits. These are key things that the report clearly sort of did a good job analyzing and presenting, data-driven findings for us to be able to make decisions. One thing we have to remember is that all these actions are not happening in isolation. They are actually happening as an interconnected web of systems that will definitely rely on each other as we deal with them on a daily basis. In fact, the report's central message is simple. The global water system is operating beyond its means. This is because in many basins, the old baselines that we have are gone, or maybe they are inaccurate, and we cannot rely them. Some predictions are not that accurate as we see them. So there's a lot happening, and that is, I would say, the fact about the post-crisis realities that we have to come to terms with. And one important thing we need to remember is that this declaration sort of brings to bear that the crisis has changed the operational conditions permanently. So now it's not business as usual, but we need to take a different approach to dealing with the water situation that we see happening around the world. It's also important to remember that this crisis is not only an environmental crisis. So leaders, because sometimes leaders often treat water as an environmental topic. Some look at it just as a requirement for sustainability reports. Others see it as a marginal issue that does not require strategic or major focus in their decision making. But this report is saying otherwise. It says that we shouldn't consider water as a marginal issue because water bankruptcy is a structural risk that has to be at the center of every decision that we make as society and as organizations and companies. And this is because water actually underpins everything in the world: food security, health, public health, urban stability, energy, you name it. All those areas of human endeavor are actually underpinned by water. Not to talk about the current surge in the need for water from most of AI centers. So there's a lot going on that we have to remember, that the water system is failing. It's failing us as humanity. So we need to show up in terms of discipline actions and also concrete ways of measuring how we assess progress with what we do. So those are some of the things that the report sort of clearly talks about. The impact these situations have on politics or governance, conflict, migration, all are well spelled out in the report. That is worth looking at. And with the analysis and the diagnosis, the report actually sort of concludes or summarizes that the water bankruptcy situation, it's an institutional and economic problem. Because of the loss of our wetlands, there are lots that if you want to monetize those, these will be in trillions of dollars. Our ecosystem, capital or services, those are in monetary terms, huge amounts of money, even though we have issues regarding how we estimate or value these ecosystem services. And that's one of the areas that we need to, as a sector, interested parties, look at. So, in other words, the report is saying that we should look critically at the balance sheet risks for water. So, that's one thing that we shouldn't consider now as an option, but it is a tax that should be central to every decision that we make. So leaders must elevate water from just being an environmental concern to a strategic issue. I know this has been done in most of the corporation, but then there's a lot that has to be done with regards to taking another step towards monetizing the ecosystem of water services in a way that we can confidently report on progress. There are a couple of things, in my opinion, that the report doesn't clearly say, and I would put them all under governance, more or less, governance. So here is where leadership must pay attention, in my opinion, regarding what the report says. You know, the report is strong, as I mentioned earlier on diagnosis. It is a directional principle. Sometimes, the use of the word bankruptcy looks very operational, but then the report is using the word bankruptcy to signal institutional direction, or the direction of principles that we have to look at. In other words, it's now time for us to restructure the plans that we have. But then it doesn't clearly say how that restructuring should take place, or whether there should be a plan, or how the plan should look like. So that's more or less something that I guess leaders and managers of different actions will have to look at. The report also does not clearly answer the question of who reduces consumption first in terms of sequencing, and which sectors must contract. Those are some of the key things that I see that the report doesn't clearly speak to. And also how much demand reduction is required. The report doesn't clearly articulate that based on the analysis, but I guess that is action for other agencies to take on. And again, this report, it's mainly not an operational report, it's more of a strategic direction or vision for how to deal with issues related to water. The report also does not clearly say which basins are formally insolvent. That's one thing that is a bit silent on, and what the priority order should be in terms of water being insufficient in certain areas. So that's also not very, in my opinion, not very clearly, laid out. Because in financial bankruptcy, what you see is you have, your balance sheet, the creditors, hierarchies, trigger thresholds, and a restructuring pathway. All these are clearly laid out for you to be able to do the necessary monetization and an assessment, and come out with what is solvent and what is insolvent in this particular situation. But in our situation where we have water bankruptcy, I would say these are more of governance instruments that are missing, not the way the financial sector actually deals with the way they look at bankruptcy. But in our case, it's more of governance instruments that are missing, and the way we deal with things. So the report named this as what? Insolvency. And it does not provide the full operational exit. Even though it names that insolvency, that is something that we have to deal with, it does not clearly give how the sector will be able to move away from being insolvent to solvent. That's one, I would say, clarity that is, to me, it's not easy to pick from the report. And it's fair to say, and this is an intentional way, it is not a flaw in the report, in my opinion, but it's just signaling that science, it's mainly to look at the diagnosis side of issues, and leaders are more or less responsible to operationalize some of the findings of what is being found from different analysis of this. So I think it's an intentional approach for the report to be silent on that. So we shouldn't see it as a weakness of the report, but just looking at it that leadership now has a big job to do, taking the diagnosis into consideration. And if leadership has a big job to do, then we'll have to see where we are currently in terms of what is working. With the sector entering, an era of bankruptcy, a couple of conditions will have to be in place. You know, Currently, what we see is the different financial tools or systems that we have to deal with water are not very broad and still have some challenges. If you take climate finance, for example, today, largely that approach is mainly project based, and the focus is on funding resilient projects, adaptation and infrastructure efficiency upgrades. So those are the things that the current approach to dealing with crisis from a financial lens is happening. But if we want to adopt a bankruptcy governance approach, it requires a total shift, or not a total shift, but a significant shift in the way we do things. First, it requires restraint. It also requires that we should contract in our insolvent basins. And more importantly, it requires that we deny growth where water is no longer viable. Making sure that we don't, develop areas where we know there is water stress, or the replenishment level in those basins and catchments or watershed are no longer viable or under serious threat. So that's and also making sure that we have up to speed or are on top of our natural capital accounting frameworks, so that we are able to monetize and account for everything within the different basements that we work. And that will mean that our budgets will have to reflect the real situation, and then making sure that all the enforcement triggers that we have are in place. If we don't do that, I'm afraid we run the risk of getting ourselves into a dangerous mismatch between what our balance sheet is showing with regards to water resources and what our investment flows into that sector is actually saying. Because what will happen is, nature will always take its course, so the aquifers will still continue to be declining, and our shortfall in terms of what we are investing into that, if it doesn't match the level of decline, then the problem will still be there. So that's one thing we need to be able to sort of look at. We need to take steps to improve, the way we report resilience, for instance, so that at least you'll be able to better tackle or reflect our water, availability situation in terms of how it is worsening, and also the way we report, on water issues will also have to be clearly evidence-based. That is happening, but it means we'll have to take it a step forward. And we need to tie all this into a governance structure that will speak clearly to addressing the situation that we are facing when we are actually operating in an era of water bankruptcy. Yeah. The situation looks dire. People will be like, okay, if we are not able to replenish our water aquifers the way we are using them, so where is the hope? So that's a big question. I would say there is hope, and the hope uh, actually relates to how we are able to operationalize the findings from this report. And what does that mean? It means that we need to take out a clear restructuring of the water sector that we do, make sure that water to us it's something that we know that is under serious threat, and we need to embrace what the report actually talks about, which is solvency governance, more or less looking at how leadership roles, policy, and structures, decision-making systems will be able to support what we do in order to make our water resource remain solvent. So that's very, very important, and that's the way we need to go. It's not easy given the problems that we are currently facing with the sector with regards to monetizing or reflecting our services in financial terms. So, but there is hope that if we consider this as a strategic and structural issue and not as a marginal one, we'll be able to make headway. And to do that, we need to make sure that we meet our obligations. We are able to address the core functions of every action that we take, and have a focus of avoiding a long-term collapse of the systems or the water resources that we have. And that will require that we are actually on top of our water budgets and making sure that we align, water withdrawals with the renewal of aquifers. And the other aspect that is also very important is dignity, protecting the dignity of water and prioritizing allocation of resources in terms of hierarchy. Affordability and optionality are also key things that we need to consider if we want to stay solvent in terms of the way we use water. So these are a couple of things that, in my opinion, that we need to work on, mainly governance-related issues. But there's a need to speed up because these actions require that we work, fast in a way that we'll be able to at least, if not able to reverse, satisfy the actions with the different usage that we are undertaking. We should always remember that the goal for all this bankruptcy declaration is to prevent future loss or future decline in our water resources and take actions to stabilize what we have remaining for the future. So in a bankrupt system or a water bankruptcy era, we need to take steps to stop the bleeding of our water resources. And if we do that, there's hope. There's hope for the future. Everything is not lost. So what leaders must understand in this era are 5 things, more or less. 1, water is no longer a background resource. It is a governance constraint. And 2, we are no longer talking about efficiency now, but it's more of solvency, how to optimize without caps and accelerate and not accelerate depletion of our water resources. And 3, bankruptcy requires explicit priorities. We can't be silent on how power is used to address our problems anymore. We have to be clear on what exactly we want to do and what the sector wants to engage in. Then 4, we need to align our finances with our hydrology because it's important that the capital that we have must be conditioned on solvency. And then 5, now leadership is more of restraint with the focus on innovation. So that's what we need to do. We need to be able to make sure that our leadership posture is anchored on restraint and innovation. The era of global water bankruptcy, it's not the end of the solution, but rather it's the end of the denial that the sector has actually been exposed to for years. So let me close with this. A crisis asks for better solution. Bankruptcy asks for better decision. The report names the condition we are in, and what follows now depends on governance. The future will not judge us but what we knew. It will judge us about what we chose to do when we knew what we knew. So leadership matters most when rescue is no longer guaranteed. And that is the moment that we are in. So if this reflection speaks to you, ignites a deeper reflection or analysis of the report, subscribe to Small Insight, Big Impact for more discussions and reflection on other leadership topics. Thanks for taking time to be with me, and see you in the next episode. All the best.